All right, so I want to talk about what is happening in Brazil right now because we have just gotten some news that it appears like tomorrow on September 7th, there are going to be some massive protests across Brazil, and there are going to be protests backing up the far-right authoritarian fascist president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. And so what do I mean when I say he is an authoritarian and a fascist? Well, just to give you one perspective, okay, this is what he said recently, okay? So this was on August 28th, so literally just about a week ago. So Bolsonaro says he will be arrested, killed, or declared winner. And so what he's talking about here is next year in 2022, Brazil is going to have presidential elections. And so in these elections, he is coming face to face with a guy named Lula da Silva, who was previously in prison on trumped up corruption charges that he was later basically exonerated from. But his opponent, Lula da Silva, is one of the most popular politicians in the history of Brazil. While he was the president of Brazil, I believe from 2003 to 2010, he was like the most popular politician in the world. So he's a very well-liked guy in Brazil, and Bolsonaro is getting absolutely clobbered by him in the polls. And so Bolsonaro is not happy, and that's why he said something like this. Quote, "I have three alternatives for my future: being arrested, killed, or victory," he said in remarks to a meeting of evangelical leaders. And Bolsonaro later added that the first option is out of the question. "No man on earth will threaten me," is what he said. Okay, so this guy, Jair Bolsonaro, fake tough guy, many similar qualities to Donald Trump, a neo-fascist, a guy who doesn't believe in democracy by any stretch of the imagination, and literally cannot envision a future in which the popular vote, or the people of Brazil, in a similar way to Donald Trump, decide that he is not their favorite person and they want to install somebody else as their leader. So again, he's basically setting up a situation similar to how Donald Trump would here in the United States, where he's convincing his supporters, albeit they are a minority in the country, he is convincing his supporters that there is no way that we can lose this election. And if we are losing this election, it basically means that there is a secret socialist plot where they are trying to unseat us and steal power from us. So it's a really dangerous situation. And again, the reason why he's coming out and saying this is because he's going to lose in the natural election, right? If the election is to proceed as it currently is on pace, it's not even close. Okay, so Lula here from Bloomberg on May 12th, and you can go and look at the polling data. I mean, it has been very consistent clobbering by Lula here. So Lula would beat Bolsonaro in Brazil's election polls show. So Lula to take 55% to Bolsonaro's 32% in the 2022 presidential vote. So listen, our election here in the United States between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, it was way closer than this. I mean, Joe Biden ended up winning by, what was it, 7 to 10 million votes in the popular vote. But in terms of percentages, it was not that far off. We're talking about 20-point differences here, okay? So we're talking about an election that is not even close, all right? So Lula absolutely clobbering him, and that's why Bolsonaro is fearful, basically. He's scared, and this is what it looks like when you back a fascist into a corner and they are scared of losing power. So basically what this coup attempt, or this march that's going to be happening tomorrow is it is a pathetic last-minute attempt to try to rally his supporters using violence, using force, whatever means necessary. He literally said that he is willing to die for this. So rallying his violent supporters to go and march against democracy and to try to cling on to power. So it's a desperate attempt by a wannabe authoritarian who is trying to drastically change the makeup of what Brazil looks like. And he even says that himself, which we're going to get to in this well-written Intercept article here. But just to give you another perspective of who this guy is, he's a really weird guy. I mean, this guy, I swear to God, has gotten COVID 5 times over the course of this, somehow manages to continue getting it, and always ends up in the hospital, and always takes these weird fucking pictures in the hospital where he looks like he's dying. I mean, he literally looks like he's dead. I don't know why, if you're the president, that you would let them take pictures of you like this. It just seems pretty weird, in this one especially. Like, what the fuck is going on here? But I'll leave that to you guys to explain to me. But anyways, weird guy, authoritarian, fascist, pretends to be a man of the people while actually representing some of the most corrupt aspects of the Brazilian economy and government. And he's really trying to undo a lot of what you could call their democratic institutions. And so here from The Intercept, really great write-up here by Andrew Fishman, so all credit to him. But I wanted to read to you some of the details and context of what these marches are actually going to look like. So Jair Bolsonaro's Pro-Coup rally, September 7th, is shaping up to be Brazil's January 6th, so he made this comparison. And supporters of Brazil's far-right president Jair Bolsonaro are organizing online to take to the streets on Tuesday and begin the overthrow of the country's democratic institutions. Quote, "It's all or nothing now," said an unnamed narrator in a video shared in pro-Bolsonaro online messaging groups. Quote, "Take to the streets this September 7th or we'll be slaves." Another video called for patriots, again, the overlap between the United States and Brazil, take to the streets, and that he called for patriots to donate money and participate to begin a general cleansing process in Brazil. So whenever fascists are using the words cleansing, that is as big of a red flag as you could possibly ask for. And they continue saying it's no coincidence that the first decree under Brazil's US-backed military dictatorship was called Operation Cleanse, and the diktat, issued in 1964 as the generals took power, initiated a witch hunt to remove leftists and other political opponents from positions of power, and began a 2 decades of brutal political repression that included censorship, mass arrests, torture, rape, and assassinations. And Brazil's far right is calling back to that history now, without the wink and a nod, to restore their order at the expense of democracy. And the hard right believes that since the military relinquished control in 1985, that Brazil has deteriorated, and that a rejuvenated communism, they say, must again be purged, resisted, and battled back by any means necessary. So again, you see the overlap here in the United States, right? Where they basically frame the entire issue as if there are socialists and communists who are trying to take over all of our institutions. We hear this every single day from conservatives online, and even Trump himself, about how it's actually communists that are trying to take over the government. It's actually communists who are trying to dismantle democracy, and so we have no choice. We have no choice but to fight back, maybe even with violence. This is the narrative that Trump was selling his supporters that led to the January 6th insurrection, right? He portrayed it as though there's no way that we could have possibly lost this election because I'm a man of the people. I am loved by everybody, and so if I lost the election, that means that they must be trying to steal it from us. Who's trying to steal it from us? Radical socialists and communists. It's the overlap is almost a one-to-one correlation in terms of rhetoric. So it's really just amazing to see this playbook being used again, and it has been used throughout history. But in online groups for organizing the September 7th rally, the zeal for undoing democratic institutions was on full display, and pro-Bolsonaro activists, for instance, offered suggestions for banners, quote, "Remove all the Supreme Court ministers," one read, while another said, "Activate the armed forces." If things line up, Bolsonaro will gaze upon these slogans in person, and he will reportedly speak at the rallies in Sao Paulo, Brazil's largest city, and Brasilia, the capital, and other small events will be occurring across the country as well. And so just to give you more of a perspective in terms of the framing, the rhetoric that they are using, which again is similar to what Trump did, but here's what they talk about: a pro-democracy coup, right? So this idea that you're not actually overthrowing democracy, but you're actually saving democracy from the radical communists, right? It's a way for them to justify it to themselves and make themselves not have to admit basically that they are authoritarians and fascists. But so Trump framed his actions not as an attack on democracy, but as a defense of it, a violation of the Constitution to save the Constitution. Quote, "You're protecting our country and you're protecting the Constitution," he told the crowd on January 6th before they marched on the Capitol to impede Congress from executing the duties mandated by the Constitution. And quote, "When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules," Trump said. So again, making up the claims of fraud. We litigated this throughout all of these different legal proceedings that went after the election that took place. Trump's people, they brought him all to court. They didn't win any of the court cases except for like 1 out of 75 or however many there actually were. So we litigated this. There was no actual widespread fraud, but still Trump using that rhetoric and saying, if you catch somebody in a fraud, well then I don't know, maybe violence is the solution, right? Opening the door for violent actions to be taken in defense of democracy, supposedly, even though we know that that's just a bullshit lie that they tell themselves. And so they continue saying, "This is the standard tactic of right-wing coups for decades, as outlined in Vincent Bevin's book, The Jakarta Method. Invent a left-wing coup plot and launch a counter-coup to prevent it. We didn't have a choice," they'd argue. "Extreme measures were required to save the country." And Bolsonaro is following a similar logic, replete with the same lies about electoral fraud, and he has claimed publicly that the event is a pro-democracy rally focused primarily on freedom of speech. Again, you see the overlap here with what conservatives do in this country. They call themselves, the freedom of speech advocates and the First Amendment advocates, and then they turn around and they think that, teachers should not be allowed to teach that the KKK was immoral, and they want to control speech at every single level, right? They are the actual infringers on all of our constitutionally protected rights, and yet they pretend like it's the opposite of that, right? And so echoing tropes used by far-right extremists worldwide when they are on the defensive, but that rings hollow once you examine their true authoritarian platform. And like Trump, Bolsonaro says fraud is rife. He's repeatedly claimed without evidence that even his landslide 2018 win was amid a fraudulent election, and that if Brazil does not change its voting system for 2022, he will not accept the results. And there are whiffs of Trump complaints about the deep state. Bolsonaro has argued that his movement is being prosecuted by the Supreme Court. Again, just like Trump did, right? Blaming the Supreme Court for not overturning the election for him, and then he turns around and says the Supreme Court, which was a conservative Supreme Court, and many of the judges who struck down the cases that he was bringing of election fraud were also Trump-appointed judges, and yet still he pretends as if there's some deep state cabal that's out to get him, and Bolsonaro obviously using the same tactics. But despite all the democracy talk, however, coup-mongering remains at the top of Bolsonaro's agenda. An opportunity for the Brazilian people has never been so important, or will be so important, as this coming September 7th, he told the crowd last week, quote, "Many want me to take certain measures. I believe that we are going to change the destiny of Brazil." So frightening language that he's using here, but eventually he added a meager reference to the Constitution, a Constitution that, written in the wake of the dictatorship, many of Bolsonaro's diehard supporters view as a communist document that must be replaced. So again, you see the overlap that is happening between what is about to take place in Brazil. The difference between that and January 6th obviously is, although there are many differences between the United States and Brazil, obviously in their political systems and how their economies have functioned and the history of their countries, but the similarities are overwhelming, right? And one of the main differences here is that he's doing a preemptive coup, right? So with Donald Trump, it basically was leading up to the election. You know, he wasn't really talking that much about voter fraud. He was talking about the potential with mail-in voting and how, oh, this is unsecure, basically just setting it up so that if he lost, he could then claim voter fraud. What Bolsonaro is doing here is he's working, forward first, right? So he's coming out and telling his supporters to do the January 6th insurrection attempt, but basically before the election even takes place, right? So to send his supporters out there to do a display of violence or mass demonstration in some form against democracy and against the democratic processes and in favor of Jair Bolsonaro maintaining power as he said he wanted to do. And basically they're sending their supporters out there before the election even happens. And so this is what's going to happen tomorrow, September 7th. Again, it happens to be my birthday tomorrow. Side note, doesn't actually have anything to do with the commentary here, but September 7th, he's going to be sending a bunch of these violent, armed Bolsonaro supporters, far-right fascists who don't give a shit about democracy and think everything is a communist plot against them and against their power structures. And you look at who is supporting Bolsonaro in the country. It is wealthy, landowners. It is wealthy oligarchs and stuff like that. It is not an far-right fascist, normal everyday fascist, but it is not the overwhelming majority of the people. We saw the polling data, right? He's even less popular than Donald Trump is here in the United States by a significant margin, okay? So he's not going to win the election if it actually takes place. And so this is something we have to pay attention to because Brazil is a massively important country in terms of the politics and how South America is going to be functioning, right? And I covered in my video, which I'll link down in the description below, when we were talking about the Peruvian elections and how Pedro Castillo, a socialist candidate, won those elections over the far-right fascist Keiko Fujimori. And after she lost the election, she was doing the same goddamn shit where she was coming out and talking about how it was a communist overthrow of the government. She was all but calling for the CIA to come in and directly intervene. After she lost the election, she was saying it was a communist plot. She was saying we need to regain our free markets and free institutions, etc., etc., etc. It's all the same language. It's the same ploy that fascists use over and over and over again when they know that they are going to lose out to the more popular left-wing candidates. And so if you want to see socialism succeed in South America, if you want to see a South America that is not bogged down by a Western capitalism or by U.S. imperialism, then you got to support Lula and you got to pay attention to this shit, because what's going to happen tomorrow and in the subsequent months leading up to the 2022 presidential election is going to determine what one of the single largest country in South America and one of the largest and most influential countries in the world and economies in the world is going to look like for decades to come. So we can't let Bolsonaro be successful in this, and we got to keep talking about it, because if we allow this type of stuff to be normalized and we allow this type of stuff to be slipped under the rug and nobody's talking about it, then the likelihood that his coup attempt succeeds is all the more greater. So just wanted to give you guys a perspective on this, and I will probably be making a video about this tomorrow after we see what this actually looks like and give you guys an update then.